At the family dinner, my dad yelled in my face, "You and your kid are just freeloaders." My mom smirked in agreement, ridiculously, while they were living in my house. Without hesitation, I calmly said, "You have 24 hours to leave." The pot roast was still steaming in the middle of the table when he said it. Nobody had touched it. My daughter's water glass had a ring of condensation spreading out from its base, soaking slowly into the tablecloth, and she was staring at that ring instead of at her grandfather. Like if she looked at it hard enough, the last 10 seconds would rewind themselves. "Excuse me?" I said. I set my fork down very deliberately, tines facing left, the way I always do without thinking about it. "You heard me?" he snapped. His face had gone that particular shade of red it goes when he's decided he's right before he's finished the sentence. "You waltz around this house acting like the two of you are doing us a favor by being here, and meanwhile you're just living off what your mother and I built." I almost laughed, not because any part of it was funny, but because the sentence was so completely inverted from reality that for a second my brain simply refused to process it. The way you sometimes misread a word on a sign and have to look twice. My mother didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She had that look on her face, the small, closed-mouth smile she gets when she believes she's just watched someone else lose an argument, even when the argument hasn't started yet. She reached for her wine glass and took a slow sip, watching me over the rim of it. "Say that again," I said, not because I hadn't heard him. I wanted to see if he'd actually say it twice. "You and that kid," he said, jerking his chin toward my daughter without looking at her, "are freeloaders. Plain and simple. Living here, eating our food, acting entitled about it. I'm done pretending otherwise." My daughter's fork was still in her hand, hovering an inch above her plate. She hadn't moved since he'd started yelling. 6 years old, and she already understood enough to go very still and very quiet when adults raised their voices at the table, which told me something about the last several months that I hadn't let myself look at directly until right then. I looked at her first, not at him, at her. "Sweetheart," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "Can you take your plate and go watch something in the living room for a few minutes?" She looked at me, then at her grandfather, then back at me, and something in my face must have told her this wasn't a request she should negotiate, because she nodded once and slid off her chair without a word, carrying her plate carefully with both hands the way I'd taught her, and walked out of the dining room without looking back. The second she was out of earshot, something in me went very quiet and very clear, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm actually arrives, after all the wind has already stopped. "You don't get to call her that," I said. "Not in my house, not ever again." My father's eyebrows went up like I'd said something absurd. "Your house," he repeated, and he laughed, one short, humorless syllable. "Since when has anything in this family been about ownership? We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 18 years, and now you want to stand there and lecture me about whose house this is?" "I'm not lecturing you," I said. "I'm telling you." My mother finally spoke. "You always do this," she said, setting her glass down with more force than the moment required. "You wait until you're cornered, and then you play the victim. It's exhausting, honestly." I felt something settle in my chest, cold and very still. I thought about the last 2 years. I thought about the folder sitting in the bottom drawer of my office desk, the one I'd been keeping there for exactly 6 days, the one I hadn't told either of them about yet because I'd wanted to do this gently, on my own terms, over coffee on a Saturday morning instead of across a dinner table with my daughter in earshot. They had taken that choice away from me about 90 seconds ago, and I found I wasn't sorry about what came next. "You have 24 hours to leave," I said. I said it calmly. That was the strange part even to me in the moment, how calm my own voice sounded, coming out of my own mouth, like it belonged to someone who had rehearsed this 100 times in the shower and finally gotten the chance to say it out loud. My father blinked. For a second, neither of them said anything at all. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear the television my daughter had turned on, the tinny sound of a cartoon theme song, absurdly cheerful against the silence in the dining room. "You're joking," my mother finally said. I wasn't. But to understand why I could sit there and say it so evenly, why some part of me had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment without fully admitting it to myself, you have to go back almost 2 years, to a Tuesday afternoon in March, when I found out by accident that my parents were about to lose everything they owned. I didn't hear it from either of them. I heard it from my aunt, my mother's younger sister, who called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was between meetings and asked, in the careful voice people use when they're about to hand you something heavy, whether I'd talked to my mother that week. I hadn't. We talked most weeks, but not that one. "She called me crying on Sunday," my aunt said. "I don't think she wanted me to tell you, but somebody should, and it isn't going to be your father." The short version was this. 3 years earlier, my parents had put almost everything they had into a business idea of my father's, something involving a specialty equipment rental company that a friend of his had convinced him was a sure thing. It hadn't been a sure thing. By the time they admitted it wasn't working, they'd refinanced the house twice to keep it afloat, missed 4 mortgage payments trying to buy time, and the bank had already sent the second notice of default. My aunt said the third one, the one that actually starts the foreclosure clock, was expected any day. I sat in my car in a parking garage for 20 minutes after that call before I could make myself drive anywhere. I want to be honest about something, because it matters for everything that came after. My father and I had never been close in the easy way some fathers and children are. He wasn't cruel when I was a kid, not exactly, but he was a man who measured almost everything by whether it made him look capable, and a son who preferred reading to sports and organization to charisma, had never quite fit the shape of what he wanted to be proud of. My mother ran interference between us for most of my childhood, translating his silences into something gentler than they usually were. None of that stopped me from calling him that night. He didn't want to talk about it at first. He tried to tell me things were under control, that they had options, and I let him say all of that before I asked him directly whether the house was going to auction. There was a long silence, and then, very quietly, in a voice I'd almost never heard him use, he said yes. I didn't decide to help him out of some grand feeling of forgiveness or reconciliation. I decided because I thought about my mother, who had never once in my life asked me for anything, and clearly wasn't going to start now, even as she watched her home get taken out from under her. And I thought about the fact that I could actually do something about it, and I didn't see the point of being the kind of person who has the ability to help and chooses not to out of old resentment. So I looked into it. I found a real estate attorney through a friend, someone who specialized in pre-foreclosure sales, and over the next several weeks, we worked out a private purchase before the house ever hit auction. I sold the smaller townhouse I owned at the time, rolled the proceeds into the down payment, and took out a mortgage in my own name for a property that had, until 6 weeks earlier, belonged entirely to my parents. The arrangement, when we finally sat down and talked about it as adults, was simple enough on paper. They would stay in the house, I would pay the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, and most of the maintenance, since my father's income at that point barely covered his own daily expenses, and my mother hadn't worked in over a decade. In exchange, they'd help out with my daughter sometimes, since I worked from home and could use the flexibility, especially on days when meetings ran long or travel came up. That was it. That was the whole agreement. I remember my mother crying at that kitchen table, the same table where 2 years later, my father would call my daughter a freeloader and telling me she didn't know how she'd ever repay me. I told her she didn't need to repay me. I meant it. For the first year, it worked the way I'd hoped it would. My father, humbled by everything that had happened, was quieter than I'd ever known him to be, almost deferential in a way that felt strange on him, like a coat that didn't quite fit yet. My mother threw herself into helping with my daughter, picking her up from school, teaching her to bake, sitting with her during homework in the evenings while I finished up work. There were moments during that first year when I let myself believe something had genuinely shifted between all of us, that the crisis had cracked something open in my father that might actually let a little more warmth through than usual. It didn't last. I can point to the exact season it started to change, though I didn't recognize it as a pattern at the time. It was the second autumn, when my father, apparently feeling steady on his feet again for the first time in years, started talking less like a man who'd been rescued, and more like a man who'd simply been inconvenienced by a temporary rough patch that was now, in his mind, fully behind him. I remember the specific dinner where I first felt the shift, though I couldn't have named it that clearly at the time. We were sitting around the same table, my daughter maybe 4 years old then, and my father made an offhand joke about how he'd earned his keep that year by watching her 3 afternoons a week while I finished up a big project at work. It was meant as a joke, delivered with a laugh, but something in the phrasing snagged at me even as I laughed along with everyone else. Earned his keep. As though the arrangement between us had quietly reclassified itself in his mind from gratitude into labor, from a debt he was working to eventually feel he'd repaid, and once repaid, entitled to something in return. I told myself I was reading too much into a single joke. People say things at dinner tables that don't mean anything beyond the moment they're set in. I went back to eating, and if you'd asked me that night whether anything had actually changed between us, I would have told you no, nothing at all. Everything was exactly the same as it had been the year before. He never thanked me again after that, not once, in any of the 18 months that followed. And somewhere in there, so slowly I couldn't have told you the day it started, gratitude curdled into something else entirely. The erosion, once it started, took the form of 100 small things, none of which seemed worth a confrontation on its own. My mother started rearranging my kitchen cabinets, moving the mugs from the shelf beside the coffee maker to a cabinet across the room because she didn't like reaching across the counter for them. I noticed. I didn't say anything because it felt petty to fight about mug placement in a house I owned, but that she'd once owned too, and some instinct in me kept wanting to preserve her dignity even as she chipped away at mine. My father started making comments about my parenting in front of my daughter, small offhand remarks about screen time or bedtime or the kinds of snacks I kept in the pantry, delivered in a tone that was technically joking, but always landed with an edge underneath it. Once at dinner, he told her that video games would rot her brain, loudly enough that I knew it wasn't really meant for a 6-year-old. It was meant for me. There were other things too, things that at the time felt like unrelated irritations rather than pieces of a larger picture. My father started asking, with what seemed like idle curiosity, whether I'd ever considered adding him to the deed just in case anything happened to me so that my daughter would be provided for without complications. I told him there were simpler ways to handle that, through a will and a trust, and that the deed didn't need to change for any of that to work. He dropped it, or seemed to, though he brought some version of the same question back around every few months, always phrased a little differently, always framed as concern for my daughter rather than anything to do with himself. One afternoon in early spring, I got a call from a woman who introduced herself as a notary working with a local title company, asking to confirm an appointment for a document signing later that week. I told her she had the wrong number, that I hadn't scheduled anything with a title company. She apologized, said she must have misdialed, and read back a name that wasn't quite mine, close enough that I assumed it was simply a database error somewhere and didn't think much more about it. I mentioned it to my father in passing that evening, half as a joke about wrong numbers, and he laughed a beat too long and changed the subject to something about the lawn. I want to be honest that I notice things. I'm not someone who walks through life oblivious to the people around me, but noticing a series of small, strange, disconnected details is not the same as understanding what they add up to. And for most of that year, I filed each one away under ordinary family friction, rather than anything more deliberate. My mother had always been particular particular about kitchens. My father had always needed to feel some measure of control over his surroundings, and losing the house outright, even to me, even under generous terms, must have chipped at something in him that he'd never fully examined. There was also, around that same time, a stretch of about 3 weeks where my father started asking my daughter, in the gentle, roundabout way adults sometimes use with children they think won't repeat things accurately, whether she liked living in Grandpa's old house, a phrase that struck me as odd the first time she repeated it to me at bedtime, since the house had been legally mine for well over a year by then. I corrected her gently, told her it was just our house, and thought nothing more of it beyond a passing note that my father apparently still thought of the place in the old terms, out of habit or nostalgia, nothing sinister in it that I could see at the time. Around the same stretch of weeks, my mother mentioned, almost in passing while we were folding laundry together one Sunday afternoon, that she and my father had been meaning to get their affairs in order, and asked, in a tone I read at the time as ordinary end-of-life practicality for people in their 60s, whether I thought a family attorney could help them update their will to reflect how things actually stood now. I told her that sounded reasonable, and offered to recommend someone, and she said she and my father had already found someone through a friend, which struck me as slightly odd, only in the vaguest way, gone from my mind again by the time the laundry was folded. There was one evening, though, that stayed with me longer than the others, even though I couldn't have told you why at the time. My father had a friend over, a man I only knew vaguely as someone he'd played golf with for years, who mentioned in passing over drinks on the back porch that he'd gotten into real estate a few years back, doing consulting work for people navigating complicated property situations. My father laughed and said something like, "Might have to pick your brains sometime, given everything going on around here," and the friend said, "Sure, anytime," and the conversation moved on to something else entirely. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in my hands, half listening, and feeling a small, cold flicker of unease pass through me, gone almost as soon as I noticed it. I told myself it was nothing. Fathers talk to old friends about all kinds of things. It didn't mean anything specific. It certainly didn't mean anything about me, or the house, or the arrangement we'd built so carefully over the past 2 years. I went back to washing dishes, and by the next morning I'd more or less forgotten the whole exchange had happened at all. It would be almost 5 months before I understood exactly what that conversation on the porch had actually been. The discovery happened almost by accident, the way these things usually do. I decided to refinance the mortgage that spring, mostly to take advantage of a rate that had dropped since I'd first bought the house, and my loan officer asked me to come in so she could walk me through some discrepancies she'd found while pulling the title history for the new application. I remember sitting across from her desk, only half paying attention, expecting nothing more interesting than a clerical note about an old easement or a boundary survey from decades ago that nobody had ever bothered to update. "There's a recorded document here I want to flag for you," she said, turning her monitor slightly so I could see it. "It's a quitclaim deed filed about 7 months ago. It never went through, but I want you to know it's sitting in the county records with a rejection notice attached." I didn't understand what I was looking at for a moment. A quitclaim deed transferring an interest in the property from me to my father, dated the previous autumn, bearing what was supposed to be my signature, and notarized by someone I'd never met in my life. "It was flagged and rejected at the recorder's office," she continued, watching my face carefully, the way people do when they suspect they're about to deliver news that's going to land harder than they can fully prepare someone for. "The notary's commission number didn't match anyone licensed in this county. Whoever filed it either used a fake commission or an expired one. The recorder's office runs a basic verification pass on notarizations now, which is honestly not something that happened everywhere even a few years ago. It got caught before it was ever actually recorded against the title. As far as the law is concerned, right now it never happened, but it's sitting in the file as a rejected attempt, and I thought you'd want to know, given that we're about to submit a fresh application in your name." I sat there for what felt like a very long time without saying anything. I thought about the notary who'd called to confirm an appointment for a document signing that I hadn't scheduled, reading back a name that wasn't quite mine, close enough that I'd assumed it was a database error. I thought about my father's friend on the back porch, the one who did consulting work for people navigating complicated property situations, and the little cold flicker of unease I'd felt and immediately talked myself out of. I thought about every offhand comment my father had made over the past year about adding him to the deed just in case, each one a little more pointed than the last, each one something I'd dismissed as ordinary paternal anxiety rather than what it apparently actually was, which was reconnaissance. Somebody had tried to forge my signature on a deed transferring partial ownership of my house to my father. Somebody had used a fake or stolen notary commission to try to make it look legitimate, and it had failed, not because anyone in my family had a change of heart, but because a county clerk's office had recently updated a verification system that neither of them had known to account for. I asked my loan officer what would have happened if it hadn't been caught. She was careful in how she answered. "If it had gone through cleanly," she said, "it would have created a real cloud on your title. It wouldn't have made your father a legal co-owner outright, not with a fraudulent signature behind it, but it would have been messy and expensive to clear, especially if he'd then tried to use that recorded interest as leverage in some other transaction. That kind of document, once it's sitting in the public record, gives someone a lever to pull, even if it's ultimately not enforceable." I called the real estate attorney who'd helped me with the original purchase and told her what I'd found. She pulled the recorder's file herself the next morning and confirmed everything the loan officer had told me. The rejection notice was dated, time-stamped, and unambiguous. The notary commission number listed on the document didn't correspond to any licensed notary in the state, current or lapsed. I didn't confront my father that week. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was that I genuinely didn't know yet whether he'd done this himself or whether his golf friend, the one with the vague real estate consulting business, had done it for him, possibly even without my father's full understanding of how illegal the specific method was. Part of it was that I needed time to think clearly instead of reacting from the kind of white-hot anger that had been building in me since the moment I'd seen my own name signed in handwriting that wasn't mine. But mostly, if I'm honest, it was because I understood immediately what this meant for everything going forward. My father had not simply drifted into entitlement over the 18 months since the rescue. At some point, likely not long after he'd started feeling steady on his feet again, he had decided that gratitude was a debt he no longer felt like carrying. And instead of simply asking me for something or even fighting with me openly about the arrangement, he had tried to quietly manufacture a legal claim to a house that was, in every true sense, entirely mine. That explained the pointed questions about the deed. It explained the strange notary call I'd brushed off as a wrong number. It explained the porch conversation I'd almost immediately forgotten, and the odd, satisfied way my father had carried himself for a few weeks last autumn, like a man who believed he'd quietly solved a problem that nobody else knew existed yet. I spent the next several months building a case I hoped I'd never actually have to use, keeping meticulous records of every mortgage payment, every tax bill, every dollar of maintenance, gathering everything my attorney told me I might eventually need, all while continuing to live in the same house as two people who had no idea I now knew exactly what they'd tried to do. I didn't know yet that it would come to a head over a pot roast on a Tuesday evening, or that my father would hand me the excuse I needed by calling my 6-year-old daughter a freeloader at his own dinner table. But I know now that some part of me had been waiting, quietly and patiently, for exactly the moment when I'd have both the standing and the reason to finally say what needed saying. "You're joking," my mother said again, into the silence that followed my ultimatum. I wasn't. I got up from the table, walked to my office down the hall, and pulled the folder out of the bottom drawer where it had been sitting for 6 days. Ever since the closing had finally gone through on the arrangement my attorney and I had spent the better part of a year quietly assembling. When I came back into the dining room, my father hadn't moved. My mother had turned in her chair to watch the doorway, and something in her expression had shifted from smug to uncertain, though she was clearly still working hard to hide it. I set the folder on the table, between the untouched pot roast and my father's wine glass, and opened it to the first page. "What is this?" he asked. His voice had lost some of its earlier heat. "A modified deed of trust," I said, "filed 6 days ago. It restructures the mortgage under a new rate, consolidates the title cleanly under my name, and includes a formal notarized statement from a licensed notary this time, confirming sole ownership with no encumbrances or competing claims of any kind." I watched his face very closely as I said the last part. He went pale in a way that told me everything I needed to know about whether he'd understood, in that moment, exactly what I meant by competing claims. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, too quickly. "I think you do," I said. "I know about the quitclaim deed you tried to file last autumn. I know it used a fake or stolen notary commission. I know it was flagged and rejected by the recorder's office before it ever cleared, which is the only reason it isn't sitting in the public record as a cloud on my title right now. I've known for months." The color drained further out of his face. My mother's mouth opened slightly, and for the first time all evening, she didn't have anything to say at all. "That's not," my father started, and then stopped, because there wasn't an honest way to finish that sentence that didn't make things worse for him. "I've spent the last several months," I continued, keeping my voice level, "documenting every mortgage payment I've made on this house, every tax bill, every repair, everything. Because my attorney told me that if you ever tried something like that again, or tried to use the rejected filing as leverage in any other way, I needed to be able to show exactly what the truth actually was. I didn't want to believe you'd done it deliberately. I gave you the benefit of the doubt for longer than I probably should have. You have no idea what you're accusing me of," my father said, but the words came out thin, without any of the conviction he'd had 5 minutes earlier when he was calling my daughter a freeloader across the same table. "I'm not accusing you of anything tonight," I said. "I'm telling you what I know, and I'm telling you that you have 24 hours to pack what's yours and leave this house. You can't just throw us out," my mother said, finding her voice again, though it came out smaller than before. "We're your parents. You're the people who forged my signature on a legal document," I said, "and then, less than a year later, called my daughter a freeloader in the house I bought to keep you off the street. I think I've been more than fair." My father stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. For a second, I thought he was going to say something else, something angrier, something that might have escalated the whole evening into a version of itself I wasn't prepared for in front of my daughter, even from another room. Instead, he just stood there, one hand braced on the table, staring down at the folder like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if he looked at it long enough. 24 hours, I said again. I mean it. Neither of them said anything else. My mother reached over and closed the folder, very gently, the way you might close the lid on something you didn't want to look at anymore. And for a moment, the three of us just sat there in a silence that felt entirely different from the one that had opened the evening. Down the hall, the television was still playing, tinny and cheerful, completely unaware of what had just happened 40 feet away. I didn't know yet, sitting there, that 24 hours would come and go without either of them packing a single box. 24 hours passed, and my father's suitcase remained exactly where it had been the day before, unopened, in the hallway closet. I found him at the kitchen table the next morning, drinking coffee like nothing unusual had happened. And when I asked whether he'd started packing, he told me, without looking up from his phone, that he'd spoken with a lawyer, and that this isn't as simple as you think it is. I asked him what that meant. "It means," he said, finally sternly looking at me, that your mother and I have lived in this house for years. We've contributed to it. We've helped raise your daughter. There's something called equitable interest, and my attorney seems to think we have a reasonable claim to it, whatever your paperwork says. I want to be honest that hearing him say the word attorney so soon after I'd shown him a folder describing a fraudulent filing he'd tried and failed to make struck me as almost impressively shameless. But I also understood, standing there in my own kitchen, that this was no longer going to be resolved with a folder and a firm sentence across a dinner table. It was going to be resolved through the actual machinery of the law, the same machinery that had already once quietly caught what he'd tried to do. I called my attorney that afternoon. She wasn't surprised. This happens more often than people expect, she told me. Once someone realizes the private conversation didn't work in their favor, they look for a legal theory that might. Equitable interest arguments based on contribution or reliance do exist, but they require a lot more than living somewhere for free and helping out occasionally. Given everything you've documented and given what's already sitting in the recorder's file about the quitclaim attempt, I think you're in a much stronger position than they realize. She explained what would need to happen next. Since my parents weren't leaving voluntarily, and since there was no formal lease or tenancy agreement between us, we'd need to go through a proper unlawful detainer process, the legal mechanism for regaining possession of a property from occupants who refuse to leave. It meant serving formal written notice, waiting out the statutory period, and if they still hadn't left, filing in court and letting a judge decide. The house, in the weeks that followed, became a strange and uncomfortable place to live. My parents stayed, technically within their rights to do so until the legal process laid out, and the three of us moved around each other with the careful, hollowed-out politeness of people who both know a war is happening and have agreed, without discussing it, not to fight it out loud in front of the child in the house. The hearing date, when it finally came through, was almost 3 months after the night of the pot roast. In the week before the hearing, my attorney and I sat down in her office and went through everything, page by page, the way she said we needed to in order to be fully prepared for whatever argument my father's side chose to make. We had the original closing documents from the private sale, 3 years old now, showing the transfer clean and complete before the house ever reached auction. We had every mortgage statement since, each one paid on time, each one paid entirely by me. We had the property tax records, the insurance policy, and receipts for repairs going back years, and we had the recorder's file on the rejected quitclaim deed. This is really the heart of it, she said, tapping the printed rejection notice. Whatever equitable interest argument your father's attorney tries to make, this document changes the entire conversation. It's not just that he doesn't have a legal claim to the property, it's that he apparently already knew he didn't have one, tried to manufacture one through fraud, and failed. A judge is going to weigh that very differently than a simple family dispute over who's contributed what to a household. I asked her whether we'd be able to prove definitively that my father was the one behind the filing, rather than simply benefiting from something someone else had arranged without his direct knowledge. She was careful in her answer. We may not need to prove that conclusively for the possession case itself, she said. The core issue in front of the judge is simply whether you own the property outright, and whether your parents have any lawful right to remain in it. The quitclaim attempt matters most as context, as an explanation for why an equitable interest argument doesn't hold water here. If it later becomes relevant to a separate criminal matter, that's a different question, handled by different people, and not something you need to resolve today. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. I hadn't set out to have my father charged with anything. I'd set out to reclaim something that was already, factually and legally, mine, and to stop pretending that patience alone was a strategy for dealing with someone who no longer felt bound by gratitude. My daughter, in those final days before the hearing, seemed to sense that something was coming to a head, the way children often do, even without being told the specifics. She asked me one evening, while we were doing her homework at the kitchen table, whether Grandma and Grandpa were going to court. Yes, I told her. There's a judge who's going to decide some things about the house. Are you scared? She asked, and the question caught me off guard, both because it was so direct and because I hadn't expected a 6-year-old to think to ask it. I thought about lying to her, telling her everything was simple and certain, the way a lot of parents might in that moment. Instead, I told her the truth, in language I hoped she could hold on to. A little, I admitted, but I know what's true, and I have all the paperwork to show it. Sometimes being scared and being ready are the same feeling. She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away for later use, and went back to her math worksheet without asking anything else. The morning of the hearing, I put on the same navy blazer I'd worn to the closing 3 years earlier, the one I hadn't touched since, and drove to the courthouse with my attorney's binder sitting on the passenger seat beside me like a passenger of its own. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, a plain municipal room with fluorescent lighting and rows of wooden benches. My father sat across the aisle beside his attorney, a heavy-set man in a gray suit who kept glancing at his watch, and my mother sat beside him, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. My aunt sat 2 rows behind them, on my side of the aisle. The judge, an older woman with steel gray hair pulled back into a low bun, moved through the docket ahead of us with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen every version of every argument a courtroom like this one could produce. When our case was called, my attorney rose first and laid out the basic facts. Sole ownership established through a documented private sale 3 years prior, an unbroken record of mortgage, tax, and insurance payments made entirely by me, no lease or tenancy agreement of any kind, and formal notice to vacate that had gone unanswered for the full statutory period. My father's attorney stood next and argued that my parents had an equitable interest in the property based on years of contribution to the household, including caregiving support for my daughter, and that removing them now would work a serious injustice justice. The judge listened without much visible reaction, occasionally making a note. When my father's attorney finished, she looked over her glasses and asked a single question, directed at my father himself rather than at his lawyer. Mr. she said, using my father's last name, were you aware of a document filed with the county recorder's office approximately 11 months ago? A quitclaim deed purporting to transfer a partial interest in this property to you, bearing a notarization that has since been confirmed as fraudulent? The room went very still. I didn't file that, my father said. His voice cracked slightly on the second word. That wasn't quite my question, the judge said, with the flat precision of someone who knew how to notice when one hadn't been answered. I asked whether you were aware of it. My mother's hands, still folded in her lap, had begun to tremble slightly. I knew someone was looking into options, my father finally said. I didn't know exactly what form it would take. I see, the judge said. She turned to my attorney. Counsel, is the rejection notice from the recorder's office part of the record here? My attorney confirmed it was, and handed up the copy we brought, along with the sworn statement from the county recorder's office, confirming the notary commission number listed on the document had never belonged to any licensed notary in the state. The judge reviewed it for what felt like a very long minute. The only sound in the room, the soft rustle of paper and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. When she finally looked up, she addressed the room generally, in the clear, unhurried tone of someone dictating something she intended to be remembered exactly as spoken. I want to be direct about what I'm seeing here, she said. The petitioner has produced complete and uncontested documentation of sole legal ownership, established through a lawful private sale, maintained through 3 years of exclusive financial responsibility for the property. The respondents have produced no lease, no co-ownership agreement, and no evidence of any legal interest in the property whatsoever. What they have instead is a rejected attempt, roughly a year ago, to manufacture a legal claim through a fraudulently notarized deed, which this court takes extremely seriously, and which entirely undermines any argument that the respondents believed in good faith that they held some equitable stake in this home. She looked directly at my father as she continued. An equitable interest claim generally rests on the idea that someone acted in good faith reliance on an understanding about a property. It is very difficult to argue good faith reliance in one breath, while in the other, this court is looking at a fraudulent filing attempting to seize exactly the interest you now claim you were relying on all along. Those two positions cannot both be true. She granted immediate legal possession of the property to me, ordered a formal writ of possession to be issued if my parents had not vacated within 7 days, and in a final note that she stated for the record with a level of deliberate clarity that I understood even in the moment was meant to be heard by everyone in that room and not just written into a file, she said this: let the record reflect that this court finds no lawful claim on the part of the respondents to any interest in this property, and further finds that the attempted quitclaim filing constitutes a serious and separate matter. This court strongly encourages the petitioner to refer to the appropriate authorities should she choose to do so. I didn't say anything as she moved on to the next case on her docket. I didn't need to. Everything I had been carrying quietly for the better part of a year, every planted question about the deed I'd brushed off, every strange phone call I dismissed as a wrong number, every uneasy flicker I'd talked myself out of on a back porch months earlier, had just been read into an official record by someone whose entire job was to weigh exactly this kind of claim and say, plainly, who was telling the truth. My aunt, 2 rows behind me, let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding. My father sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, staring straight ahead at nothing, and my mother had finally stopped trembling, replaced now by a stillness that looked less like relief and more like the particular kind of silence that comes after you've run out of anything left to say. They packed within the 7 days. There was no dramatic final scene, no apology, no moment where either of them sat me down and said anything close to sorry. My father spent most of that week on the phone in the guest room with the door shut, arranging something with a rental agency 2 towns over. My mother packed in near total silence, wrapping her kitchen things in newspaper the same careful way she'd once shown me how to do as a child, boxing up the years without once looking at me while she did it. My aunt came by twice that week, once to help my mother carry boxes to a rented storage unit, and once just to sit with me at the kitchen table after my daughter had gone to bed. She didn't say much. Mostly she just sat there with me, which felt more honest than anything she'd offered in the months before the hearing, when she hadn't known which version of the story to believe. On the last morning, my father stood in the front hallway with 2 suitcases and a box of paperwork, waiting for the car my mother had already loaded. He looked at me for a long moment, and I thought for just a second that something might finally pass between us. Some acknowledgement, some fragment of the man who'd once quietly, briefly, been humbled enough to let a little warmth through after the foreclosure. He didn't say anything. He picked up his suitcases and walked out the door. My mother paused in the doorway on her way out behind him. For a moment, I thought she might say something too, and some small, tired part of me almost wanted her to. Even an excuse, even something small and insufficient, just so the last word between us wouldn't be silence. She looked at me, then past me, toward the kitchen where she'd once taught me to fold laundry the way her own mother had taught her. And then she turned and followed him out to the car without a word. My daughter and I stood at the front window and watched the car pull away down the street, and she slipped her small hand into mine without either of us saying anything about it. We stood there for a while after the car had turned the corner, long after there was anything left to actually watch. That evening, we ordered pizza, the same kind we always got, and ate it at the same dining room table where all of it had started, except this time there was no pot roast steaming untouched between us, no ring of condensation spreading across the tablecloth from an untouched glass. My daughter took a long sip of her water, set the glass down, and looked around the room at the empty spot at the head of the table where her grandfather used to sit, at the quiet, ordinary evening light coming through the window behind her. "It feels different in here," she said. I looked at the same spot she was looking at, and then at her, and I nodded once, and reached over to wipe a smear of sauce from the corner of her mouth before she could ask me anything else about it.